Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Medical Myths, the show about what not to do with your body. And today, my special guest, I think you all know who this is. This is the lovely Katy Montgomerie.
Yay!
How are you today, Katy?
Hello, I'm good. It's really nice weather here in England, which is like it's our one of two nice days a year. So had a good
I was going
day.
to say, nice weather in England? What is this?
Yeah, I know. I didn't actually know it's nice. I was in bed in the morning, and then one of my friends sent me a message being like, "It's too hot," and I was like, "Yes, this is like finally." When everyone starts whining about being hot instead of whining about being cold, that's my time to shine.
So I think everyone here knows where they can find you on the internet. Would you like to introduce yourself to my audience?
Yeah, you can only find me in the darkest corners. If you go on Google image search and type in frog and then go to the 59th page, that's where you'll find me. Just like no, you can come to my Twitter, which is /Katy Montgomerie, to see me arguing with dickheads, which is basically all I do and all I am. And I usually argue about feminism and LGBT rights. Or you can go to my YouTube channel, which is also Katy Montgomerie, and it's spelled the opposite way around to what you think. It's just here. Hopefully you can see that. KatyMontgomerie. And I usually talk about trans rights and talk to interesting trans people.
Well, you're on today with a less interesting trans person, so I hope that's okay with you.
Literally the most boring trans person I've ever encountered. But
yeah, I mean, we're here to talk science. So that being said, our topic today is about the sex binary, which is a topic that's going all around. But before we talk about that binary, I have a bone to pick with Katy, and Katy has a bone to pick with me. So we won't take too long to assert ranch saucepan superiority, but I had
ranch
to.
Saucepan.
I had to. This is ranch. See on this side here, there's ranch, and then
ranch
saucepan. It's a saucepan.
No, to me, it looks like you've got a bucket of slime with green bits in it, and then you're like boiling bubble bath water or something. Like, what was going on there? But yeah,
it's a saucepan with, I think that's water in it.
No, it's like bubbles. But yeah, I know that's what.
Today's episode is brought to you by Ranch Saucepan Productions. As you can see, I have a new logo in the top of my screen. So there you go. But so the sex binary is a topic that is very important, especially to the trans community, because it is weaponized to basically say that trans people don't exist. And this is actually the topic that had me start my YouTube channel. I would not be here without this topic and without Katy Montgomerie, because I got my start in the side chats of the Transatlantic Call-In show, and I would just be screaming at my computer saying, if only these people understood embryology, they would not be making these claims. And I kept saying that every single episode. No, to the callers. And so I would leave him like, hold on, I should start a channel and talk about embryology so then people have this understanding. And so that's why I'm here. So y'all can watch those videos. But I owe this show and this whole channel to Katy and this topic. So don't get too egotistical about it. You're not that cool, but just a little bit cool.
I'm pleased that it's inspired some people to do some things, because I was inspired by other trans people, and you'll start inspiring people. The more like trans people making content and doing their special topics, like you're a doctor or soon to be, so your specialist topic is this, but maybe you're a trans person who likes art history or something, and there's so much misinformation about that, or maybe about sociology. Like, just start churning it out, and it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. So we have some absolute cringe to talk about today, and I've picked out some articles that, oh, look, a cat.
Here's Poppy.
Everyone say hi to Poppy. So the articles we're gonna start with today are from Fair Play for Women, which I know Katy has talked a lot about. You know more about this organization than I do. Would you like to share what this is?
So Fair Play for Women is a British organization, and it's a gender critical organization. Gender critical is like the movement in the UK, which is attacking trans rights and pushing back against trans rights. And Fair Play for Women is one. Like, there's loads of these organizations all sprung up in the space of a few years. And they're all usually led by one person who is always a cis person, almost always a straight person, and who has no experience with trans people at all. And they just campaign against our rights, raise a load of money, do some attacks and stuff. They're one of the biggest ones, and some of they've had a few success stories in court. They managed to take away the legal guidance for trans people in the England and Wales census, I guess, is their biggest one. I don't know. It sounds kind of pathetic, but they are kind of pathetic. But they are actually one of the most prominent sources for misinformation on certain topics. If you ever see someone claiming that the crime rates of trans women are the same or worse than cis men, it comes from a Fair Play for Women article. If you ever see them claiming that over 50% of trans women in prison are sex offenders, that comes from Fair Play for Women. And they're one of the like sort of hubs of gender critical misinformation, and they're garbage. And the person who runs it is now professional anti-trans campaigner, because she gets enough money to have a very good salary campaigning against our human rights. Hooray!
Which is so gross. And they use a lot of rhetorical tactics that are dishonest at best.
Oh, constantly, yeah.
And we're going to go through this article and probably another one and really address what they're saying and why they're wrong. Because we can sit back and laugh at things all day, but I think understanding is really important, and knowing why somebody is incorrect about something, so we can move forward and read other articles from them and say, okay, this is the same tactic that they used, and here's why it's not good. So they have this article called "Sex is Binary. Scientists Speak Up for the Empirical Reality of Biological Sex." And right away, we have a picture of a sperm and an egg, which this is not an article about fertilization. But this is the picture they have
by
chosen.
Colin Wright and Emma Hilton. Okay.
And they already try to invoke some credibility for these authors. You have an evolutionary biologist and a developmental biologist. So already they're coming in with this kind of appeal to authority. They're saying, I'm a scientist, we're both scientists in biology. This is our field of study. You should listen to us. And they say some garbage. So let's read their garbage. It's one thing to claim that a man can identify as a woman or vice versa. Increasingly, we see a dangerous and anti-scientific trend toward the outright denial of biological sex. The idea of two sexes is simplistic. An article in the scientific journal Nature declared in 2015. Biologists now think that there is a wider spectrum than that. A 2018 Scientific American piece asserted that biologists now think there's a larger spectrum than just binary female and male. And in October 2018, New York Times headline promised to explain why sex is not binary. And then the next,
I was just going to say, do you want me to just cut in when I have a thing to say, or?
Yeah, I mean, we can. I was going to go to the next paragraph, but if you have, since this one's just talking about what other people say.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on how you pointed out they, introducing themselves as biologists, and then they are raising these. Well, they mentioned Nature, which is like one of the prominent journals in the entire world. One of the most major scientific journals, full stop, but particularly in biology and related studies. And they've made the claim that sex isn't binary. I think, I haven't read ahead on this at all. I don't actually like the word spectrum, but maybe we'll come to that argument in a bit. We'll see.
Yeah, we can talk about that. So I'll read this next paragraph, and then we can break it down, and then I might read just like this little block here, and then we'll address it, because this is about to be juicy. Is sex a spectrum? The argument is that because some people are intersex, they have developmental conditions resulting in ambiguous sex characteristics. The categories male and female exist on a spectrum and are therefore no more than social constructs. If male and female are merely arbitrary groupings, it follows that everyone, regardless of genetics or anatomy, should be free to choose to identify as male or female or to reject sex entirely in favor of a new bespoke gender identity. So we can address this a little bit.
That isn't the argument. Like, they like to strawman the position as intersex people exist, therefore sex is a spectrum. But that wouldn't be enough alone, because you could imagine a situation where you come up with a definition of sex and then there were 3 values, and that wouldn't then be a spectrum. So that alone can't be the argument that we're making. And I think, having interacted with Colin White briefly before he blocked me for disagreeing with him, I think lots of these, part of the straw man of this is to claim that trans people and nature and various other scientists are claiming that there's like some kind of sliding scale, and like there exists people all the way along this one-dimensional sliding scale, and that's what the spectrum is. And I guess we'll go into that more in detail, but it's not just like one-dimensional. So yeah, this is where I see their argument going.
Yeah, and it's interesting that like they definitely are straw manning here with they're bringing in, and the whole conversation about sex versus gender is a whole different conversation entirely, but they're using the social construct idea, which is not our argument for biology. We're not equating a social construct with biology. So this is a weird attempt at them to it's I mean, at best it's a straw man, because that's not at all what we're arguing. We're not saying that sex is a social construct.
Well, I would say that it, in the like multi-dimensional space of sex characteristics, if you wanted to split it into a binary, then you've got to draw an arbitrary line, and where we draw that line is decided upon by society. It's not a like natural category. Like, we could categorize people like someone who has 2 arms, and then the other group can be people who don't have 2 arms, and that'll be 0, 1, or 3. And as long as, you know, we have some vague definition of what an arm is, you could say, you know, it's got to be as far as the elbow or whatever. You could then create some kind of binary, and you could argue that was like a natural grouping, people with 2 arms and people who don't, although it's not a very useful grouping. But if you've got a load of, if you're trying to make a binary definition for sex, there aren't any natural groupings that split everyone into one of 2 things. And as soon as we have like we do have some intersex conditions, and people argue about whether they are like a male intersex condition or a female intersex condition, because they often give them those groupings. And some intersex conditions were once considered a male intersex condition and now considered a female one. And in that sense, humans have just made a decision. Oh, we're going to put this thing into another box, and that in a sense is like a social construct. But it's not a social construct in the same way that like money is just something we've all agreed to do. I mean, it's more like constructed by scientists, I guess. But
it's a way to organize thoughts in our heads. It's not something necessarily that like we have to fit people in these boxes. It's like the boxes that we've made are for our own cognitive laziness. It's a way for us to categorize information in a way that makes sense to the human brain, but it's by no means conclusive of what is reality of science. Like, science does not exist in neat little boxes. It never has, and it never will. And I think there's the confusion of what the brain thinks versus what is reality, and thinking that the brain is the ruler of all this, when I mean, we're smart, but we're also really dumb. So
yeah, I think that it's important to like understand that biology is just basically humans trying to categorize things. And if we come up with some categories, and then we find something in nature that doesn't fit into one of the categories we already have, then we don't say, oh, well, this is against biology. Like, that's impossible concept, because what we're doing is just describing. We either have to extend one of the categories or make a new one. And whether we do one of those two things, or even both of those two things, and have a big argument about it, is down to just our decisions, because it's just to help us understand. It's like when we discovered monotremes, and everyone was like, well, these don't fit the definition of mammals at all, because they're laying eggs and they're like not the right body temperature and all kinds of things. But then we just decided, well, we'll just expand the category of mammal because it kind of makes sense evolutionary, and we'll kind of make their own category too, which is monotremes. But like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. It's a made-up set of categories. When you decide what's a mammal, like if we discover something else that doesn't quite fit, then we'll just change the category, and that's it.
So this next paragraph, they say to characterize this line of reasoning as having no basis in reality would be an egregious understatement. It is false at every conceivable scale of resolution. In humans, as in most animals or plants, an organism's biological sex corresponds to one of two distinct types of reproductive anatomy that develop for the production of small or large sex cells, sperm and eggs respectively, and associated biological functions in sexual reproduction. In humans, reproductive anatomy is unambiguously male or female at birth, more than 99.98% of the time. The evolutionary function of these two anatomies is to aid in reproduction via fusion of sperm and ova. No third type of sex cell exists in humans, and therefore there is no sex spectrum or additional sexes beyond male and female. Sex is binary, and this whole paragraph is such a mess.
This is like, you can see them saying this argument every single time you talk to a gender critical person. They make this exact argument and are just repeating out because they haven't thought about it, and it says what they want it to say. And this is what I mean by fair play for women being like quite a key source of nonsense for the gender critical movement and the wider anti-trans movement. And there's just so many things. Like, you see them say this all the time. They go, sex is binary, like with the shared understanding that binary means two. And they're like, it's a natural category. It's not a social construct, with the understanding that that means there's no ambiguity. No one's making decisions here. We're just observing. And then they go, it's true 99.98% of the time.
Yeah, I was going to point that out. Like, do they understand stats? Like, so it's not 100%. So that means there are exceptions. There are people outside of this binary, which by definition just destroys a binary.
Yeah, and I think that you then see this kind of like next level apologetics to when you pressure them on that, and they'll often do this. Oh well, it's only 0.02. I was just going to look up what 0.02% of 8 billion is.
Oh, go for it.
Oh,
well, while you're looking that up,
1.6 million people.
Yeah, there you go.
Which is quite a lot of people. So like they'll often be like, oh well, it doesn't matter, it's only a few. Or the truth is, if it's a binary in the true meaning of what a binary is, that means two. That means even if there was one single example, if there's 8 billion humans on Earth and there was one who didn't fit in, then we couldn't say human sex is a binary, because we'd have three groupings in that situation. And the fact that we've got, even by their claim, 1.6 million people who don't fit into this, is rubbish. And especially when we assume, like, there's two errors here. They could either say people fit into a binary 99.98% of the time, in which case we say, well, then it's not a binary. But they're also saying unambiguously male or female, as if if that introduces a whole new concept of, can someone be ambiguously male or female? Because that's kind of undermining this idea that there's any kind of human categorization going on here. How can it be ambiguous at all? Ambiguous means humans have some interpretation to do. And if we're interpreting it, we're deciding which category this goes into rather than it just naturally being in a category. That's the argument that they've just said is like untrue. They've said, oh, well, it's not a social construct because almost everyone fits in without human intervention. It's like, it's just so poor. It just seems like one of these arguments where you're like, well, I'm definitely true. Ignore the exceptions. And like,
yeah,
that's just rubbish.
And this is something that kind of gets on my nerves with these arguments is the idea that there is one keystone factor that will assign you to one of the two categories. Like,
Yeah.
because if you try to talk to them and say, well, these are the factors involved. You have from the biology perspective, we have multiple categories of sex. We have chromosomal, so your genotype. You have how you appear, your phenotype, and your phenotype is broken down even into your internal phenotype and your external phenotype, because those anatomies don't always align. That's going to be your anatomical sex, and you have your hormonal sex, which can be different than those other two. So we don't have this one thing that makes you a certain sex. And they like to say, well, but those are just characteristics. That's not what sex is. Like, but sex is just characteristics. That's what we are using to
literally all
classify
sex
people
is. Yeah.
is characteristics. And they say, well, but what is the one thing that makes all the other things happen? Like, but there isn't one thing that makes all the other things happen. There are certain variables that play more of a role than others, such as SRY has a significant role. However, it is not the only factor. You take somebody even who would be considered a binary female, and they have congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is nothing related to their chromosomes, and it's nothing related to their reproductive system at all. This is related to their adrenal gland and their hormones. And you take anybody who's binary and expose them to hormones in utero, and you can get a completely different result purely from hormone influence. So there isn't one keystone factor, and we have to stop letting them claim that there is one, because we do not agree that there is one.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this brilliant Robert Winston little clip video. And he was, I don't know if you know, I think he's Dr. Robert Winston, or it might be Professor. I don't know if you know his name. He's
don't
like
know.
he's quite a famous British TV science person who's had TV appearances before. And he's on some discussion show, and he says something like, every time that I bring this up, I get a load of hate mail, but I'm going to say it now anyway. Sex is binary and you can't change sex. And then he pauses for like half a second, and he's like, you have brain sex, chromosomal sex, hormonal sex, and like lists off a load of different types. And I'm like, wait a minute, mate. And then the gender criticals often will share this. They'll be like, well, are you disagreeing with this like eminent doctor? And like, hang on a minute, he's disagreeing with him. Like he's just said you cannot change sex. It is a binary. And then he goes on to list an example of sex as hormonal sex, which you can change and isn't a binary. And then also lists like chromosomal sex, which you can't change but isn't a binary. And well, I mean, you can change some of your chromosomal makeup with like organ transplants, but like his own like argument undermines that, and it's because when we're talking about sex, like the physical sex of someone, you're right. There's all these different things that make it up. Sex is literally just characteristics, and I think I often make this point that gender critical people believed in like sexed souls, and that's not their explicit claim, but when they describe what they believe sex is, you're right. They say this thing like, oh, well, what's the one thing that makes all this happen? And there isn't one. It's a combination of characteristics. And like, what's the one thing everyone has in common? Well, there isn't one thing, but you can see that they believe there is. There's this kind of overarching thing, which is like sex. And it doesn't matter if your chromosomes don't match. It doesn't matter if your hormones don't match. It doesn't matter if any of your real measurable physical real world characteristics match, because your magic value of sex is this, and it can't change, and it was decided at conception or at whatever point they think it comes out. But yeah, it's as soon as you and as soon as you get them to accept that there's more than one type of sex, then their argument's falling apart, because then you can start asking them examples. Well, what sex is someone who has these chromosomes and these hormones and these genitals? And then what sex is someone else who has these things, and ask these combinations. And the fact that they have to start making decisions, or deferring to people who have previously just made a call about which box these people fall into is revealing that it's not a natural grouping and that humans have made it up.
Yeah, and with the whole sperm and ova thing that they love to talk about, they love to say this is the one thing is your gametes. And I've seen Katie say this multiple times that like we can't ignore people who don't have gametes. There are lots of people that don't have them, and not all of them are
Maybe
trans.
even
There are
most
lots of cis people. There are lots of cis people that don't have gametes.
It might even be most people alive today because it's all boys under like the age of 10 or something.
That's true.
And then
yeah.
it's all men over like the age of 70 maybe, or some men of high age. And then like most women over the age of 50. And there's a lot of people, maybe not most, but that's a large percentage of the planet that don't have any gametes. But also another important point sorry, I'm proper ranting off here. Another important point to bring up on this gametes thing, when they like try and class people by gametes, is even if we just accept that gametes themselves are binary, there are either eggs or sperm, and that's it. A human could have eggs, or they could have sperm, or they could have neither. Or I have actually seen a paper with an example of someone who at one point in their life had both. It was a cis man who found out that he had one ovary which had ovulated in the past and caused some condition which he had to have it removed. So in that case, we've got 4 different values. If you pick a random human on Earth, they could have one of any 4 values here. And even if you want to ignore the both one because it's super rare, the other 3 are all really common. You've got a person who has sperm or eggs or neither or both. So what sex are all those people? Like, there's a difference between gamete sex as to human sex, which is the combination of all the characteristics.
Did you hit your saucepan? Yeah. Do you have a saucepan?
I dropped some ranch into the saucepan. I didn't because I'd never buy ranch because it's slime. But yeah, you see the next level of apologetics for this, which is you say, well, some people don't have gametes, and they'll be like, well, it's what gamete potential they have. Gamete potential.
What determines gamete potential? Because we just mentioned that it's multifactorial. So, if you have somebody with, because I did a journal club video a while back covering a case about actually 2 cases about ovotestes. So you have somebody with ovotestes. What is their gamete potential?
Well, if they're not producing gametes, I'd argue that their gamete potential is 0, because, like, I mean, my gamete potential is none because I don't make gametes. It's just a ridiculous argument to say, oh, well, if nothing had gone wrong, then you would make gametes. It's like, well, if nothing had gone wrong, I would make sperm. But if nothing had gone wrong, then I'd make ova. Like, a different thing went wrong, didn't it? I mean, who says what wrong means? Like, if we have to change things about my body in order to get me to make sperm, then we could just change different things about my body to get me to make ova. And it just happens that both of those things are completely out of medical technology reach today, but they might not be in the future. Like, yeah, this claim about potential is such a hand wave to hide the fact that they don't have a definition for it. It's just like it sounds credible, so stop thinking.
Yeah, and we've got people in the chat talking about XXXY mosaicism, and absolutely, that's one of the main causes you get for people with these variations. And so your own body might not even agree with itself on what its characteristics are. And that's just normal for
the clearest example of that, because they do mention about other animals and plants, and obviously the whole point in this argument is to justify taking rights away from trans women, pretty much, but all trans people. And sorry, I know there's a lot more to go.
No, you're good. You're good. We it's good.
But they always try and refer to it as if this like common concept in nature. But like, there are animals where that's just not true at all. And so it doesn't do their argument any favors to make that claim. I mean, one of my favorite things to do is, well, I just do this for fun anyway, because they're so beautiful. But if you look up bilateral gonadromorph, there are quite a lot of animals that can literally just be split down the middle, male on one side, female on the other side. That's really interesting. And they can say, oh, yeah, but you're not a bilateral gonadromorph. Yeah, I know. Well, probably not. I mean, I don't know if that's possible in humans, but you can get mosaicism.
Mhm.
I know it's just this, it's all so complicated, and they want everything to fit into these neat little boxes, and not just humans, but everything. And it's just nonsense. Anyway, let's keep going if you want.
Yeah. No, we got some good stuff though. And if we don't finish everything, like that's okay because we're hitting on some really good points. And some of this gets really repetitive too.
Mm.
So they say there is a difference, however, between the statements that there are only two sexes, true, and that everyone can be neatly categorized as either male or female, false. Like they have to really specify
Oh,
their perspective.
go on.
As if I didn't know. The existence of only two sexes does not mean sex is never ambiguous, but intersex individuals are extremely rare, and they are neither a third sex nor proof that sex is a spectrum or social construct. Not
Because
everyone needs to be discretely assignable to one or the other sex in order for biological sex to be functionally binary. To assume otherwise, to confuse secondary sexual traits with biological sex itself, is a category error. Ooh,
that
they
does not
are
explain
it
the
does
claims they
not.
made.
It does not. And I love when they try to bring in stats and logic to this because they're usually wrong about how they apply this, and they're not going. They know that the majority of their audience isn't going to pick up on
No.
their fallacious reasoning. But sometimes you have people reading this who understand, and we think it's really funny.
Yeah, like this is like you see this all the time from science denying types, but they make the claim. They'll be like, "Oh, yeah, sex is binary, but it can't all be neatly categorized." It's like, okay, where you going with this? And they'll just be like, "Well, it's rare, and it's not just because it's not proof anyway. So like, it's an error. Like, stop asking me questions. Like, you haven't justified the claim there at all. You haven't even addressed it. Um,
Mhm.
not everyone needs to be discretely assignable to one sex or the other in order for sex to be functionally binary. Like the word functionally there is a bit sneaky because we're not
Mhm.
talking about functionally, we're talking about human sex. Like the value here that the gender critical movement, is claiming is important for segregating people by law. We're not talking about whether you can reproduce or not. Loads of people can't reproduce, and loads of people never find
Mhm.
out whether they can reproduce or not because they don't want to. That's a
And
that's like a Mott and Bailey. They've made this strong claim that all human sex is binary and everyone can be put into
mhm.
one of two categories. And now they've stepped back and say, "Oh well, functionally," um, which is nonsense. But then also this little bit here where they're like, "Oh
Mhm.
well, just because you can't fit everyone in ambiguously, that doesn't mean it's not a binary." Yeah, it does.
It does by
It's not a
definition.
natural category. It's if it's ambiguous, and as we were just saying, if it's ambiguous and humans have to make a decision and argue about which group they'd be better suited to be in, then we've made it up, and that's the whole argument, and you have not counted it.
And I want to talk a little bit about this functionally binary statement because we get into this with, and I've talked about this with regard to philosophical arguing frequently about how I just like I don't care about some of this like mental masturbation that goes on sometimes of like you're arguing about this fundamental reality thing that has no like application to the real world. And it's kind of a similar thing here with they have this desire to define everything so that they can have like the right answer of, well, I determined the fundamental reality of like it's mental masturbation. And if we're going to, oh, hey, we got somebody else in the, I don't know this person. Do you know this person? I don't know who this is.
I think that
But
says Team Katie.
it does not say Team Katie. I can't even speak anymore.
Because you were trying
But
to
this,
lie.
but this idea of like defining things to a point where it's no longer applicable is what they're doing, even though they're claiming they're trying to stay within functionality. I'm going to argue that they're making it worse. Like in medicine, I'm going to use my field as an example because this is really where this makes sense. Like my goal is to take care of the person in front of me, right? Like I don't need to understand the one root cause of like all your binary sex. Like that's That's not what's going to help me help this person. Let's say I have somebody coming to me and they've had some unexplained weight loss, significant unexplained weight loss. And that was the only thing they come in with. There's a lot that could be going on there, right? So I do work up. It's pretty inconclusive. Let's say that this is a cis male. And I find out, I do some scans, and I find out that this person has a uterus, and this uterus has cancer. So they have uterine cancer. If we define this binary, like, oh, well, but this person is actually male because like all these other characteristics and because they're chromosomes, it doesn't matter at that point. What matters is the person in front of me, functionally, they have a uterus with cancer that's killing them, and we need to do something about that. So this over defining is actually hurting people. And I think like they want to say that we need to use the binary to properly apply medical care. I've heard that argument, but it's going to be more harmful than saying, who is this person in front of me? What can I do for this person in front of me, whether they be binary or not?
Yeah, there's this an argument I make quite a lot, and I've got an article I wrote on Medium called "Sex Isn't Binary, but it wouldn't matter for trans rights if it was." If there was some binary property, imagine that there was something inside every single cell in your body, and you could measure it, and it just had like an M or an F on it. Like you zoom in with a microscope, and there's an M or an F carved in there. That isn't actually useful for anything. It might be a good model. It might be able to predict 99% of the time whether someone is going to have a uterus, whether someone is going to face misogynistic sexism, whether someone is going to be attractive to gay women and straight men, whether someone is going to be treated as a woman in society. It'd be a good model, but that model wouldn't be the truth. It wouldn't be something we could 100% of the time say this is always going to happen. And those rare cases are the people we're actually talking about, which are trans people, intersex people, and some people who don't quite fit into those groupings, but don't quite fit into like the typical rest of people either. And yeah, so like, if we zoom in and we find that I have an M carved into all of my cells, that doesn't stop me from facing misogyny. That doesn't stop me from needing breast cancer screenings. That doesn't stop me from getting hit on by all the straight guys at the pub. Like, so what is this used for? What is the use? There is no things in law, particularly because there's always arguments about law. There's no laws that would make sense to define, to categorize people by this characteristic, which isn't actually a thing. But then on top of that, when it comes to medicine, like you say, it's really dangerous. Like in any NHS, you can either be male or female, and that's it. And that means if I want to get letters for breast cancer screenings when I get to that age, I need to be down as female, which makes sense. But then that means they send me cervix screenings, and they wouldn't ever send me prostate screening letters. And then trans men, which I think is probably more dangerous the other way around, trans men will go down as male, and because some medical conditions are strongly determined by hormones or affected by hormones when it comes to like the sexual dimorphism of it. But then they won't get cervical screening letters, and not everyone knows when they need to go. And like, it'd be much better if there was a system that just was like, oh, this person has a cervix, therefore we need to do checks on the cervix. This person has, this body part. This person has this hormone levels, whatever.
We actually have this now.
Yeah, but that is accepting that sex isn't binary, and so that isn't allowed. So that could never happen in the UK because the gender critical lobby would push against it politically, even if it was good for people.
We have that in the US, actually, at the hospital system I'm with, and with one of the major documentation platforms. They have a whole section on gender identity and sex, and they have like, what was your sex assigned at birth? What is your gender identity? And then they have like this whole checklist of what they have, like, what anatomy do you have? What anatomy do you have like modified? what they have like all these things that you can check off. Like, this is what I have, this is what I don't have, this is what I'm wanting to pursue in the future. And like, that's the way we need to approach it, I think. Individualize it.
It's the way that we need to approach it in order to give the best healthcare possible to every single person, but it's also the way we need to approach it if we want to just describe the reality in front of us. And that reality, however much you don't want it to be, is just that humans don't just come in one of two flavors. Like, that's just a fact.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
let's see. They're about to whine about gender identity, and I think this upcoming argument is going to be even more frustrating a straw man than anything they've said before. But let's see.
Because we're no longer even on the same topic. We just radically changed topics in this article. Denying the reality of biological sex and supplanting it with subjective gender identity is not merely an eccentric academic theory. It raises serious human concerns for vulnerable groups, including women, homosexuals, and children. Women have fought hard for sex-based legal protections. Female-only spaces are necessary due to the pervasive threat of male violence and sexual assault. Separate sporting categories are also necessary to ensure that women and girls don't have to face competitors who have acquired the irreversible performance-enhancing effects conferred by male puberty. The different reproductive roles of males and females require laws to safeguard women from discrimination in the workplace and elsewhere. The falsehood that sex is rooted in subjective identity instead of objective biology renders that all sex-based rights are impossible to enforce. Hold on. I didn't realize this before, but how does your reproductive role impact your workplace? Like, what are you?
Well, let me steelman their argument. If you are someone who can get pregnant, and you're like, then you might your career can take a hit from being pregnant.
Okay,
because
that's fair. That's fair.
You could get pregnant and you could face discrimination in hiring for being pregnant because they're like, oh well, she's going to go off work in 5 months. There's no point hiring or whatever. Or you could have just had a kid and the person might be like, oh well, they're probably going to have a second kid because they're in the 30s. This kind of stuff. There is some kind of prejudice here. And when you're hiring, if you're like a sexist hiring manager and you have a woman in front of you who is wearing a wedding ring and is in like 27, 28 years old or early 30s, and she doesn't have any kids yet, you might be like, she's probably going to disappear as soon as I hire her. Then you don't hire her. And you could say, like, this is some kind of discrimination related to like your body parts. However, that where they presumptuously assume you might be about to have kids, that can happen to trans women. And so it's still not quite as straightforward as just a direct situation. Obviously, if you are pregnant, then you're going to face specific discrimination against you you probably will, possibly will, for actually being pregnant in that moment. But that's not the only form of like pregnancy discrimination. But yeah, like this, the argument they're doing here, like, or they started making it above, was that trans people are claiming that we should replace sex with gender identity. But me and you this whole time have been discussing about the reality of sex and just saying for our healthcare, we need a situation where the reality of our sex bodies are noted down and acted on properly. We're not saying, oh, well, just pretend my body is the same as the cis women because my gender identity is female. Like, no, we're saying that there's lots of different things here to consider, like chromosomal sex and gonadal sex and stuff. But then also gender identity is another property of people. And when it comes to medicine, that's useful for how the doctor should talk to the patient, but it's not useful for what medical condition you have, really. But then in other things, when we're talking about like discrimination in the workplace, it's not just women who can get pregnant who face discrimination. It is all women who will face misogyny. And
trans men.
Yeah, and exactly, and trans men too. And it's it's just more complicated than the claim they're making, which is everyone fits into a nice little box. Well, 99.8, don't ask me any more questions. But most people fall into a nice neat little box, and then that is what discrimination are based upon. And it's just not true. Like, it's just observably false.
Mhm.
The claims they're making here, and they try and sweep it all up into like one little, oh well, you're just denying the whole reality of sexism. But that's just not true. It's just their claim that it happens in a binary manner, in an immutable binary
Mhm.
manner based on your birth genitals, is just garbage.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had a whole conversation the other day about trans men and like being affected by Roe v. Wade and that
Mhm.
opinion. And the fact that trans men face a lot of difficulty, especially if you get pregnant as a trans man, that will out you to pretty much everybody. It's difficult to hide something like that. It will keep you out of men's spaces. It will keep you out of women's spaces. It will keep you out of everybody's spaces because they're like, wow, this man's pregnant. Like that's not possible. But yeah, discrimination happens to all these different people, and it's not purely based on your sex assigned at birth. There are
Yeah.
plenty of other factors. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. Wait, can you just scroll up a little bit? I think I was going to make another point.
yeah, which
Um, the irreversible performance-enhancing effects conferred
oh
by male
yeah,
puberty. Let's just accept that briefly as true. If that's
mm,
the case, is it the case that all trans women have gone through male puberty? No.
no,
So that means they are inherently, at this moment, accepting at least 3 categories of people. There is males who have gone through the irreversible performance-enhancing effect of male puberty, those that haven't, and females. So then straight away, they're saying their claim about everything should be sorted based on binary sex assigned at birth is just false, because they've just created for us 3 categories at minimum for considering sports. Um,
which I do want to get to after this article. I quickly want to address their other article about differences between
oh
male
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
female
Right.
biology.
Slam through the rest of this then.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we don't have to spend a whole lot of time with the rest of this because this is
Oh, can we just do the
yeah,
homosexuality bit?
yeah. We can
I
do
saw
that.
that
We
word
can.
scroll past.
Yeah.
The
The
denial of
denial of biological sex also erases homosexuality, as same sex attraction is meaningless without the distinction between the sexes. Many activists now define homosexuality as attraction to the same gender identity rather than the same sex. This view is at odds with the scientific understanding of human sexuality. Lesbians have been denounced as bigots for expressing a reluctance to date men who identify as women. The successful normalization of homosexuality could be undermined by miring an untenable ideology.
So this is fucking ridiculous. An extra layer of even more ridiculous than every other single claim they've made so far. The claim here is that if we start labeling people differently to how they want, that it erases homosexuality. Like, actually, mate, if we destroyed all language and we gave up on all science, people would still be attracted to each other, because that is something that happens regardless of what you know, because it's not a knowledge-based conscious decision. Sexual attraction is like a factor of humans which happens in your lizard brain rather than like your decision. So this like idea that sexual orientation is in some way affected, like someone's actual sexual orientation is affected by how we describe things, is just ridiculous. Like that is impossible for that to be how it works. Um, so that's always like incredibly frustrating. And the whole issue here is that when we're trying to describe the reality of sexual orientation, the reason why we bother describing the difference between straight and gay people at all is because people with different sexual orientations face different discriminations, and sometimes in extreme degrees, and humans have some kind of understanding of that, but it's not as straightforward as you are either attracted to like all men or all women or both, or well, no, neither doesn't exist in gender critical land. There's only 3 sexualities. um but like that just doesn't describe the reality of it. People have quite a hard time describing their sexuality sometimes, and it's just limited by the words we have. And sometimes you hear bisexual people say, well, if someone asks me what my sexuality is, I say gay, but then if they start asking a few more questions, I say bisexual. And when they start asking a few more questions, I say, well, I'm actually sexually attracted to some men and all women, but I would only ever want to marry a man, but I don't want to suddenly it's like way more complicated than just one of two boxes.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that's like completely ridiculous. And so when we're trying to describe it in a short sentence, this people attracted to the same gender identity. Obviously, no one's attracted to just gender identity, because anyone who is attracted to me now, or some of the people who are attracted to me now, wouldn't have been attracted to me before I came out, but I had the
Mhm.
same gender identity then, and that's the cause of my transition. So what is trying to be described here is the fact, and again, this is an observable fact, that some trans people pass and therefore are attractive to even the most bigoted transphobic people if they don't realize they're trans. Some straight men are attracted to some trans women, or all straight men are or potentially attracted to some trans women, and that's just true.
Mhm.
And then some trans people don't pass, but then there's a range, and passing is a whole range, and again, it's not a binary. So sexuality is just more complicated than that. So yeah, this whole claim is just
Yeah.
embarrassingly poor. Sorry, can properly rant on that. Not very medical stuff, but
Do we want to cover a little bit of their rhetoric about, I mean, we don't need to read the whole paragraph, but they're making the
mm,
argument that this is bad to teach children, that sex is not binary.
yeah. Well, I mean, go for it.
I mean, the thing is, there's a level of, and I'm not saying that you have to teach children a medical school or PhD level of biology. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right thing to do, but when we overly simplify things, we oversimplify them to the point that they are no longer correct. And I see this a lot within education, especially in lower levels of biology. And this is where we get into people thinking they know more than they do. You get a lot of Dunning-Kruger with people saying, I took college biology, I know how all this works. Well, if you move on past undergraduate level biology, you learn that a lot of what you learned is not really correct. So, like, if you study genetics, you know that Mendelian genetics is such a small part of genetics and has a lot of flaws when you try to apply it so broadly. So it's dangerous to assume that what you learned in these lower levels is going to be accurate. And when the gender criticals say, well, you just don't know basic biology. Like, well, no, I do know basic biology, but you don't know advanced biology.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah.
know the nuance of biology, which I do. Like, I'm in my doctorate. This is what I study. And we need to not necessarily force these children to go through a doctorate level of biology, but when you explain something, like explain it on at their level of understanding, but don't dumb it down to a point where it's just factually incorrect.
Also, you can teach kids the concept of scientific models, and that sounds
Mhm.
like a bit advanced, but it doesn't have to be. What you can, like, a good explanation. First time I realized this, because I remember the first time in science they were like, "Oh, what we taught you in primary school was actually wrong, and now we're going to teach you the truth in secondary school." And then you get to college, and they're like, "What we taught you at secondary school was wrong, and we're going to teach you
Yeah.
like." And I remember being frustrated at that. And then in college, someone explained that, science is all about creating a model in order to understand the universe.
Mhm.
And we sometimes have really simple models. And then as you kind of zoom out, you want more and more complicated models. And a good example is gravity. Like, you teach kids that
Mhm.
gravity makes things fall down. And then you teach them, oh, actually, gravity makes really big things go towards each other, but the Earth is really big, so that's why it makes it go towards the Earth. And then you're like, wow, that's okay, that's a more advanced model. And then you're like, well, it's not actually really big things, because black holes can be tiny. It's really massive things. And then some massive things are really small and some not massive things are really
Yeah.
big. And then it's like, what the fuck is this? And then you're like, actually, that's not how gravity works at all. It warps space-time. And like, it starts getting ridiculously complicated and people don't even fully understand gravity. But this gravity makes things fall down. Like, that allows you to build buildings. It allows you to like hunt food. It allows you to, stand on something to put curtains up or something. It's a decent enough model. But you can explain this to kids in a really simple way and just be like, oh, we teach you what's generally true, but sometimes it's a little more complicated than that. So we can say, oh yeah, you can either be a man or a woman, and that, it's usually based on whether you have a penis or a vagina. Oh, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. But we'll come to that later on, like in secondary school or something. But I don't know why why is that difficult? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But this is funny, and I wanted to touch on this a little bit. So this is one of their other articles called Biological Sex Differences, Bones and Muscles. And of course, they're using this to justify their opinions about sports. But I'm pulling this up not only because it's hilarious, but because this is an example of demonstrating where they get their information, because they have sources. Like, you can click on those red words and it'll take you to their sources. And they're really expecting people to not understand how to find sources and how to evaluate data, because this is hilariously bad. And you all know, and if you watch my channel enough, you know that I love stats and I love talking about the scientific method and research. So use those skills as we go through this to unpack whether or not you think these are sources that we should be, using and citing. There are many biological sex differences right down to the cellular level. First, let's compare the skeletons of males and females. Women are shorter, about 9% on average. And then they talk about the differences: 4% of a sample of Nigerians and 11% in people from the UAE. What are your thoughts just like looking at this article? Before even reading all of it, what are your thoughts?
This like averages are actually really complex because there's all these different kinds of averages, but an average doesn't tell you everything about the data. Like, if you had, like, if we go and measure another species and we're like, oh, on average, the females are shorter than the males, but then it turns out that 90% of all of them, including all of the males and most of the females, are all exactly the same height. But then there's a small group of females which are just much smaller for some reason, like, some developmental reason, then that would change the average, but the average height wouldn't actually be a height that any of them are. And so the average can conceal all kinds of things inside it. But then also, I don't know, like, what's the goal of this claim? Like, if we say, okay, well, women are shorter on average, okay, so we picked a random person out.
Cool. Yeah.
And I mean, well, you're taller than the average height for a woman. Yep. I am. But that doesn't mean there's no like maximum cap on it. It alone isn't it's a useful thing to say, oh yeah, women are shorter on average. Okay, cool.
That's
but that
all
doesn't
you get out
affect
of
the
that.
individual, does it? Like,
and you don't get much out of like having that fun trivia fact. Like, it's just cool. You pull a fact out of your pocket, but what do we do with it now? Not much. Like, except maybe like it has done some things, but it's not just the gender or sex difference. It is the range of heights among humans, that we have seats in your car that can move forward and backward. That's an application of height that is useful, but that's not a sex-based thing. That's just, we're trying to accommodate the most amount of people as possible. And that's useful. But this differentiation based on sex is not useful. And therefore, I don't really care I do care. One thing I do care about with regard to height and certain sex-based characteristics is that when I went through puberty, I had a lot of estrogen. Estrogen closes your growth plates, and I am now very short. I'm a very short person, and it gives me daily dysphoria, and it makes me hate everything. So that's some level of application with regard to trans people. But otherwise, like, I don't need to constantly be reminded that I'm shorter than the average man. Like, I don't want to know that every day.
Yeah, I mean, to what end would it be to learn that? And unless you're creating some kind of ranking system or placing value on men based on their height in some way, which society does do.
Uh-huh.
So if you say like, "Oh, well, you're actually the average height for a woman," it's like either you're trying to tell me that's bad or fuck off. I don't know what's the goal here. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, we can sit back and laugh at these claims all day. Like, they're not. I mean, they have the rib argument here, which, like, I think they're talking about debunking a biblical point with that. But I want to talk about stats. So we have this statement of the biological sex of an adult skeleton can be determined with 95% accuracy by measuring the hip bones alone, 83% accuracy by the skull, and 80% accuracy by the long bones. And this is something here. So accuracy, while that can be a useful tool statistically speaking, we don't really talk about accuracy alone, especially if we're referring to a test. So if you're going to determine the sex of a skeleton, we'd be evaluating the test that they use to determine that. And that is what would have the accuracy. It's not necessarily the bones being sexed. It's the test of whatever method you're using to evaluate that. That is what the accuracy is referring to. But they set this criteria for what would define. So they already set parameters that these are binary by sex. They've set those parameters before using the test to determine the accuracy of said test. So there's already bias, and it's not proving the point that I think they're trying to prove with it. But also, we don't, like, when we're saying 95% accuracy, I'd rather know, if we are evaluating a test, I want to know the sensitivity and specificity of said test. Accuracy is I don't really care as much. I want to know what are your true positives and true negatives, and your false positives and false negatives. We talk about this a lot. I want to know your confidence intervals. I want to know your p-values. There's certain values that they're not giving that I do want to know, and they're giving us values that are high, but probably less meaningful than they think.
Yeah, and it's just to make people like you throw around high numbers and hope people are just like, oh well, in that case my beliefs are confirmed and I shall stop thinking any further. Like, that's the goal of this. It's not to make a real convincing argument to experts. It's to stop people. It's to give people who are feeling unconfident about their ridiculous belief about trans people some kind of feeling that they're correct. On the measured accuracy thing, there's this concept in categorization, like the maths of categorization, which comes up a lot in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and it's that of a training set. When you're teaching a computer something, you can teach it to say you're showing a computer bones like fibia or whatever, femur. You're giving a computer femurs, and you're saying, right, we want you to class these into male or female based on all the stats you can get from them. So the computer's allowed to weigh them, it's allowed to measure the length of them, the diameter of them, it's allowed to test the tensile strength. You can get all the parameters. So how is it going to know? You've just given it a load of bones, like a load of bone. You've just given the computer some bone, and it's like, how does it know which ones count as male? Like, of course, it's got some male ones and some female ones. You have to say to it, well, male bones are like more likely to be longer, and the female ones are more likely to be this, and so on. So what you need to do is you need to give it a set of data that you yourself have already categorized. So if you want it to class 1 million bone samples, you might need to get 1,000 of them and go through them yourself and say, oh, well, this came from a man and this one came from a woman. And then you can tell the computer that, and it can spot the patterns itself and then create them. But without this data training set, it can't do anything. And that's true of any kind of categorization. And that original data set, who's classifying it and what decisions
Mhm.
are they making? If a bone, who is classing these bones as male and female in the first place in order for the test to compare against? Like that's not the
Exactly.
kind of point here. And if we're saying, oh, well, they come from people with with penises and vaginas, it's like, okay, but remember earlier when we were talking about chromosomes and hormones and trans people and intersex people, which may have even had surgeries they don't even know about. So suddenly some of these samples, like which sex are you comparing them to? You compare them to chromosomal sex or gamete sex? And in which case are you
Mhm.
actually recording that or are you just assuming it?
You have to
Um,
assume because bone structure is hormonal.
right. And this is another thing, like all of these little things are going through about um muscle strength and size and bone strength and size. Again, doesn't apply to trans people who transition before puberty at all. And then to trans people who transition during puberty and sometime after the majority of it's died down, they're affected, affects their growth. And then trans people who transition much later are much less affected by this. But suddenly it's not binary again and it's not straightforward at all. And are all of the people who they got their training set, are they all cis people or are there some trans people in there? Uh, yeah,
But
we
yeah, I
just
mean, the
don't know.
point here is there's bias. There's
Mm.
bias in this system. So I'm not inclined to trust the stats because of the high level of bias.
I mean, fair play for women. It's going to be biased as fuck. Something I wanted to oh no, I've just completely lost my mind. Just completely lost my mind. No, I completely lost my thought. What was I going to say about this?
They have finger
Um,
length on here as a factor that we should care about. What?
Sorry, you've got long fingers. You're banned from the women's toilets.
Right? And then they start talking about men and female brains, which there's no evidence for this. But this is where I wanted to show off some sources because this is funny. Okay, I'm gonna pull up the first article that they cited, which comes from a very well-known resource that people like to do their research on, and I have some opinions. It's actually the best resource you could ever use. So if you're gonna talk to your doctor, definitely do this first. Definitely go to WebMD and find an article that confirms what you think. That's the
You've
right
got
way.
leprosy.
Yeah. Well, but the funny thing is about this article is that it says, so they cite this on their differences between male and female, like bones and muscles and brains. And then the first thing that they say, so they ask, are male and female brains different? I don't think they even read the article because they say it's a mixture. They say most brains are both.
Most. Okay.
So they're already not confirming what they're saying. So they found an article on WebMD that did not make their point at all, and in fact contradicts the point that they were trying to make.
So, rule number one for anyone watching this who's like, maybe you've just come out, or maybe you're a trans ally who's just discovered this, or maybe you've not argued with gender critical people before, and you're like, now I've seen Katie and Ben point out all this nonsense. I want to go and argue with them. Rule number one for arguing with gender critical people is if they link you a source, read it. Because nine
Yeah,
times out of 10, it will
they
contradict
didn't.
what they've said. Maybe even more than that. Literally, like, the accuracy of their test on picking out crap sources is 95%. Like, it's just so common for them to link something and then you might read the abstract and you'll be like, hang on a minute, is that really what they're claiming? And then you read the like conclusion, you're like, this concludes the exact opposite of their claim. Like, all the time. So I'm not surprised at this at all. Well done, fair play for women. On form.
And this is
as usual.
why I encourage people to learn how to read studies, because so many of this pseudoscience is based on people with charisma saying things that sound they sound okay. They like to someone who is not trained in biology or not trained in whatever field of study it is. It sounds legit. It sounds like some big sciencey words, and they're probably right. Uh, until you go and you look and realize that their sources are terrible. They don't have stats, and they don't actually like they're not actually understanding the science that they're telling you. Like Dr. Oz, for example, does a really good job at sounding like he's talking science. He knows what words to use, but he doesn't actually state real science. So you have to go back and look at these sources and then understand, how did they get this data? How did they design their study? What methods did they use? What stats did they use? What stats do they have? And this is why we even have this show at all. I think this is so important. And the other article, this next
before you go
one
off,
is
can I just make a point on brains?
Go for it. Talk about brains.
There's like historically, there's always been loads of people trying to say that women are inferior. You know, that's like been a thing for a long time in science, and a lot of people have gone out of their way to try and use science to back that up. An absolute classic was saying women's brains are inferior to men's. They're smaller, they're stupider, they can't do as good maths, they can't, all this, spatial awareness isn't good. There's all these claims, and it's like the claim of there is a woman's brain and there is a man's brain, and the man's brain is just better. Therefore, women shut up and shouldn't have a vote. Like that was a classic position.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of feminist pushback to that, saying, well, this is a load of rubbish, because here is a woman who is a genius. Here is a woman who is good at maths. Here is a woman who is really good at spatial awareness, whatever. And doing studies into it and finding out that it's actually not true, that there's this binary, you either have a man's brain or a woman's brain. And so, but that got pushed to a point where there's at least some people who will claim that there is no difference between men and women's brains. Like, it's not something that is sexually dimorphic. It's just something that is randomly distributed, and any skills or intelligence or abilities will be, equally distributed in men and women. And you will often see gender criticals, because they come from they try to present themselves as feminists. They'll often say, oh, well, when a trans man says that he has a man's brain, he's making the claim that men's brains are better, and that's the lady brain fallacy, and so therefore it's sexist. But then they will turn around and say, well, a trans woman who transitioned at 4 years old and never went through puberty is still a danger to other women because she has a man's brain and therefore is much more likely to commit sexual assault. And they will simultaneously make both arguments, and both of them are false at the same time, because brains are hugely complicated, and absolutely there's some kind of nature component to behavioral differences, but the social component is a huge factor, and it's not binary in the slightest. It's multifactorial, and it's really interesting. And this is just another point where they're just completely wrong, and treating it as a binary is just ridiculous.
Slightly off topic, because I got people discussing in the chat, so I'm going to shill a little bit for myself. I don't have a super chat button yet because I'm still waiting for watch hours. So y'all should be, I don't care what you're doing during the day, just play my videos in the background somewhere.
How many hours do you need?
I'm at 2,700 right now. So
what do you need?
4,000.
Okay.
So people just play my videos in the background, give me those watch hours, and then we'll get that button.
Do you have Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-Fi, or have you said you should get one of those?
I have a Patreon, which we'll talk about that after. I'll show all my I will show all that. But I do want to pull up the last article real quick, because this source is, I clicked on this and oh man, this is funny. This is really funny. So this is a study. Say that in quotes. It's a study from the UN's Review and Alternative Media Selection. This is a conservative. This is a conservative website. And the article is called "Men Are Stronger Than Women on Average."
Gender critical people blindly trusting conservative. I thought they were meant to be left-wing feminists. This is a real shocker.
Yeah, and
Anyway.
so here's their graph that they're expecting you to not know how to interpret. Well, but even look at this, like it's not even set up like a study. Like you get this talk about the anti-science left or right. They're talking all about politics. This is a political article. But I'm not going to go through that. We're going to talk about just about their stats, because this is the part that misleads people. So you look at this chart, you have the maximum hand grip forces, F max, of young adult men. They had N equals 1,654. And then they had, for women, N equals 533. So they have this graph, and you see you have percentiles. You have your 75th percentile, your 25th percentile, and you have your average in the middle. You have men with the strongest male up here, weakest male here. So you see these ranges, right? So what they did is they took the averages, put them on a table, and said, see, look at how the boxes don't overlap really at all. There must be a difference. Well, you all know, if you watch this channel, we do not do stats like that. We do not just compare averages and say this group is different than this group. You have to demonstrate this with a confidence interval, preferably 95% confidence. And I need your p-value, or at least a or t-score, so I can calculate some p-values. You have to, because you have different, even the difference in the population size is huge. We have about less than half the amount of women as in the men's group. And you have to normalize for a lot of these variables. So it's not enough to say that the average is different. You have to say, is there a significant difference? So if the null hypothesis here is that there is no difference between men and women in terms of maximum hand grip, that's your null. You have to demonstrate that you can reject that. And the way you demonstrate is with a p-value of less than 0.05. That is what I want to see. I do not see anything about a confidence interval. I see nothing about p-values. I see nothing about odds ratios. I see nothing except an average. So this is meaningless to me.
Also,
what are your thoughts, Katie?
Well, I mean, absolutely. Once you get to the statistics, like it's just like some secondary school, like put some numbers in the table and draw a graph kind of level stuff. But like before we even get there, your data selection here, when you say young men and women, you mean cis people, don't you? And
Yep.
this is being used as an argument about trans people. So what you're saying is, I've collected up 2,000 cis people, drawn some conclusions, and then are saying that therefore it applies to trans people. But that's already an assumption that you haven't proven. You cannot say that cis men are representative of trans women even before transition. In fact, there was a study the other day I saw which suggested that the average bone density, I think, of trans women before transition was significantly, or as in statistically significantly, lower than in cis men, which is interesting because, I mean, there's no reason why trans women before transition are the same group as cis men, because, I mean, by definition they aren't, because they're experiencing gender dysphoria. And it's likely that gender dysphoria has some kind of well, I mean, it's likely, it's certain that gender dysphoria has a large nature component to it. So there's no reason why that wouldn't correlate with some physical differences. I mean, it's totally possible. And if you're going to claim that it doesn't, then no one's proven that. So if you're just going to get a bunch of cis men and get a bunch of cis women and be like, look, the cis men are stronger, therefore ban trans women, that doesn't make any sense. You need a study with trans women in it for a start.
Yep.
Like that's the absolute bare minimum that we'd expect to see in picking your data. And then secondly, then you need to do what Ben was talking about and do some actual statistics, and not just like, oh, we got 3 trans women and 7,000 cis women, and we found that on average, because it's nonsense. And this is
and we have
this is
to
100% of the arguments that you'll see from gender critical people about trans women's strength will be, well, men are stronger than women. Yeah, cis men do like incredibly frustrating. Anyway, sorry, Karen.
Yeah, well, we have to control our variables. Like, what else was at play here? Did you take male athletes, or at least male amateur athletes, who did exercise 5 to 6 days a week? And did you take women who, on average, didn't do that? Like, what training levels do we have here? What sports are we talking about? Did you have men who were all competitive climbers and women who all do soccer? Like, you have different sports that have different, like, your sample matters.
Yeah, and also there are even factors like that which are difficult to control for, because like we saw in the early stages of understanding COVID-19, they were saying, oh, this affects men much worse. And so the gender criticals were like, oh, well, that must be based on birth genitals, therefore it will affect cis women worse. And then they said, oh, well, actually, one of the main factors is estrogen. And like, oh, well, that's interesting. And another one of the main factors was smoking. And lots of the data came from China, where there is a big difference between the rates of smoking in men and women. And that's a social factor. And that might not have been something, I mean, now it seems obvious to control for smoking when we're talking about respiratory or disease that can affect your respiratory system. But like, it's not always obvious. And there could be some things like that in this. I mean, what if you found out like, oh, we actually got our data from this country, and it turns out in this country there's a really strong gender segregation, and all the women stay at home cooking all day, and all the men are like climbing up a mountain herding goats. Like, even if they weren't sports people and they don't train, you would say, oh, do you do any sports? Are you an elite level athlete? And they'll be like, no. And you're like, oh, well, look at this data difference. And it's like, well, are you controlling for the things that do affect these? Like, there might be social factors. There's loads of stuff that can affect these, and that's like what science is all about, finding out. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was true that cis men had statistically significantly stronger grip strength than cis women as a mean, like, of all humans. I wouldn't be surprised if that was true. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily is, and doesn't mean it affects cis trans women. And it's not like you can put all trans women and all trans men into just one of two boxes anyway, because it's not a binary. So
And real quick before we wrap up, I do want to look at this curve, because once again they did the same thing where they just took averages and plotted them on this logarithmic chart, and it's what is happening. Like,
which graph are we looking at? The top left?
The one on the top. I mean, both of them are terrible because it's just they plotted the averages again. And if you're going to do something like this, I at least need, because let's say they're not even trying to demonstrate significance or a causal relationship, which they are. They're making a causal claim, which requires more heavy stats. But even if, say, they were trying to demonstrate an association, if they're going for an association or a correlation, I need an R value. I need you to give me an R squared. So you're going to need to run like a regression and give me a correlation coefficient. That's what I want. I don't want your averages. I don't give a fuck about your averages. Give me the stats that matter. And maybe go learn some maybe they know, these people might know what stats matter and intentionally left it off, and I've said this, if you have a p-value that is significant, you are going to share that with everybody because you're like, hey, I demonstrated this. That is a proud moment for you when you demonstrated that you can reject the null. You would not be hiding your p-value if it was significant. But I've seen the people who do leave off p-values probably don't have significant ones.
Either that or they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Or both.
All right.
Yeah, and also just to finalize on that last point, if we do say, oh, it turns out that trans women do have a higher grip strength on average to a significant standard than cis women do, what would that mean? Would that mean therefore trans women are men? Would it mean therefore we should ban trans women from the toilets, or therefore trans women should be banned from all sports? No. For a number of reasons. One is your grip strength doesn't affect almost anything in your life apart from some competitive sports at high levels. So that wouldn't actually be an interesting statistic. It's never going to affect my life. There's nothing in my life where grip strength is a factor. So if you found out that was true, it shouldn't be affecting my life. But even then, when we get to sports, like we've already discussed, an average isn't enough because some trans women transitioned at 65 and some trans women transitioned at 6. And that is they're different on average, those two groupings, and some of them transitioned at different stages, and some of them are different ways through their transition, and some of them transition with hormones and some of them don't, and there's a whole load of things. I don't have many jars in my house, so I will agree with that.
Well, Katie doesn't eat slime, so of course there aren't that many jars.
Exactly. I do have a jar of 2 different jars of mushrooms in oil.
Ooh,
Different
mushrooms.
They were nice. And I think I have a jar of artichokes because I'm posh.
Put ranch on those. Anyway.
They've already got oil on them. They're slimy enough.
So let's take just a short minute to debrief. What are the takeaways from our conversation today? If there's anything you want the audience to leave with, what would you tell them?
Fair Play for Women are a garbage anti-trans group, and absolutely everything they say is wrong. And you should, if confronted with a blind statistic, demand where it comes from. It will probably come from Fair Play for Women. Go and look about where they've got their sources from. It's probably dismissible very trivially. And if it isn't trivially dismissible, then dig in on the science and you'll realize that it's just a bit more difficult to dismiss.
So, Katie, are you convinced now that sex is binary? Have they convinced you?
I am unconvinced, and I am unconvinced by I kind of wanted to make this point. I don't know if I have time to squeeze it in, but Emma Hilton and Colin Wright, who wrote that first article we were discussing, I had an attempt to get from them in their advanced biologist credible positions what the actual definition for sex is, like what the clear binary definition for sex is, because we can hear from all these stupid random gender critical people with anonymous profiles that sex is defined by genitals or gonads or gametes or what. Uninteresting because they're all stupid. Let's hear from the top level GC apologists what they think the true binary definition of sex is. And Colin Wright didn't have one, and I got blocked before I ever got to the bottom of that. Emma Hilton and I talked in DMs for ages and ages, and she made the claim, which I think is her current position, that sex is the binary definition of sex is on gonadal tissue. That is what makes someone a man, and that is what makes someone a woman. And therefore, if you wanted to have a sex change in her mind that actually change your sex, you would need to change gonads. And then she blocked me. I think I'm unblocked again now. But there's so many questions from here. What if someone has one of each gonad? At what stage does a gonad in transition go from one to the other? Does it need to be functioning? What happens when you have a gonad and then no longer have any gonads? Is that halfway to having the other gonads? Like, what is the function? Like, at what point do you declare whether they're functioning? If I was to grab a random cis man off the street in the future and change just his gonads, would he have changed sex? Is he now a woman? Is he now entitled to women's rights? You haven't thought this through at all, and you're like the top level gender critical biologist. And when I ask you these questions, you block me. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And it's just so obvious. Like when you think about this and someone's like, oh, it's defined by gonads. Like I just feel like as a child, I would have been like, well, doesn't that mean if we just got a random man off the street and changed him, he'd suddenly be a woman in your eyes? Like, have you not thought about that? Anyway, sorry, that was a completely unrelated rant.
No, it's all good. I think so to wrap up, we shilled a little bit at the beginning, but Katie, where can people find you? As if any of these people don't already know where to find you.
You can find me I'm not going to make another crap joke. You can find me on Twitter, or you can find me on YouTube, or you can find me on Medium, which is where all of my best arguments are. But also soon, I'm going to have my own website with all of my stuff in one place, which is going to be katymontgomerie.com. But I think if you go there at the moment, it's just a website coming soon page because I'm waiting for the DNS settings to update and stuff. But it's it won't be long. You can find me in Dickhead Land, which is exactly where Phoebe lives. It's called England.
And you can catch Katy on the Transatlantic Call-In show every Thursdays. Occasionally, I'm also there. So it's a fun time.
And you can also catch me on Talk Heathen tomorrow at 7 p.m. UK time. I think it starts. I can't remember who I'm with, but that'll be a good time if you'd like to argue about religion. And I think that's all the stuff that I have coming up.
Awesome. On my calendar, so last night we had our weekly trivia. We've got trivia on Fridays at 9 p.m. Eastern time. It's a fun time community building on Twitch. And then Medical Myths every Saturday, 2 p.m. Eastern time, except next week we're actually moving it to 4 p.m. Eastern time because my guest is Richard Gilliver, also from the UK, who wanted a bit later of a time. And we're going to be talking about quantum healing. So definitely be here for that one. And then this week, Sunday, tomorrow, I'm on the nonprofits. So we have a medical panel talking about Roe v. Wade. Tune in for that one.
Well, it's good they've got a trans man on that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's a great episode. Every other Sunday, so not this week, but next week on Nat One Heroes on Twitch, I run a D&D campaign of Rime of the Frost Maiden. So go watch that every other Sunday at 7 p.m. Central. I got to shell out all the fun Patreon links now that we're asking about it. But once again, thank you to the patrons. I actually have a new one that I found out today. I need to add to my list. Reggie, Kevin, B, Hannibal, and Tons of Mice. Thank you for your support of the channel. I really appreciate it. You can I will post the Patreon link below. That's the Discord link, but y'all can have that too. But something fun that I do after the show for the patrons is I go over to Patreon. We do a live after show where I just do shenanigans, and you'll find out what shenanigans are happening today.
This week, Ben is going to do 10 backflips consecutively. So you've got to be there.
No, I will not do that. Sometimes I watch medical shows. Sometimes I play The Sims, and we have fun. So join us there. It'll be about 15 minutes. We'll start that live if you are one of the patrons. Trying to think of if I have any other announcements. Oh, yeah. It's pronounced
ranch saucepan.
Saucepan. Ranch saucepan.
Ranch saucepan.
Saucepan. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining. It's been an amazing time. I hope I can get Katy back on here in the future because it was so fun. As long as she's like, wow, this was such a boring show.
No, it's wicked. It's fun going through and dunking on their articles. It's something that I've held off doing. I think maybe I should do it more often.
Hey, I'm down. If you ever want to do something on your channel, I'm down. Thank you everybody for joining in. Stay curious, and I will see you all next time.
Bye.